a member of the Aetherius Society. I did say he may have a title within the organisation. I'm afraid I don't know, but I'm sure he will tell you. I'm stalling while his microphone's installed. Like I said yesterday, I would ask people to be tolerant of people's beliefs, research, etc. And I don't want any ridicule. This is a serious conference this weekend, and I would ask you to listen to Mr. White with an open mind and hear what he has to say. Mr. White, thank you.
Right, first of all, I'll go across what Philip has just said there. If you feel at all that you wish to ridicule, please go ahead. We're quite used to it, yeah. First of all, though, I'd like to say that I found the previous speaker extremely interesting, especially her impressions that she should go towards things like healing. Because as some of you who may know a little bit about the Aetherius Society already realise, the subject of UFOs is only a part of our interest. Our whole interest is very difficult to put in one sentence, but we are interested in the unexplained. Not just the unexplained in the sky, but the unexplained within ourselves, within this planet, within phenomena which have been demonstrated throughout the world for thousands of years. Phenomena such as the ancient yogis, who could appear in two places at one time and give two lectures to two different audiences 500 miles apart. How is this possible? Things like the initiation rites of certain sects, where an acolyte had to be frozen into a block of ice and survive. These things are facts. They are demonstrated now and have been demonstrated for thousands of years. But also, there are things in the skies, and we believe that all these things must be studied, if not completely together, but at least with a knowledge of the relationship of all life. I want to start by relating a little personal story, which I think does two things. It says why I became interested in UFOs in the first place, and I will say my personal primary interest is in UFOs and the ancient mysteries of the Earth, not the societies, my personal ones. Explain something which says why I'm interested in the subject and why, of all societies, I became involved with the Aetherius Society. And in fact, have become so involved that I am its North of England organiser. This despite the fact that I can't be entirely crazy, since I run a design consultancy business of my own, which depends heavily upon logic, since I have a master's degree in industrial design engineering, and since I earn my living through the application of logic mixed with intuition, because anybody who thinks engineering design is entirely mathematics and physics and deduction knows nothing about it. The idea in the bath has earned me a lot of money, I can tell you that. Intuition plays a great part. About 25 years ago, I was fascinated with UFOs and the ancient mysteries. And I met a young lady who was extremely interested in healing and yoga and alternative medicine and this sort of thing. And quite honestly, we fought like cat and dog for a year because I thought she was crazy and she thought I was crazy. Why on earth we stayed together, I don't know. Except that after a while, she said something about ancient classical yoga which tied very well with something I just heard about the behaviour, reported behaviour of certain UFOs. And I said, well, hang on a minute, let's start comparing notes instead of fighting each other. And after many hundreds of hours of discussion with our friends, with ourselves, with other societies, we became convinced that the phenomenon of certainly from my point of view, the phenomenon of UFOs was or could be physical. It could be investigated to a certain extent in a physical, I'll say scientific in inverted commas way. I'll say scientific in inverted commas because many so-called scientists I meet, and I lectured regularly at Manchester University Department of Physics Astronomical Society, and if that for a member of the Aetherius Society is not putting your head in the lion's mouth, then I don't know what is. But I found some of them were anything but scientists in the proper sense of the term. In other words, the true scientist throughout the ages takes into account all the available data, not just a little slice of it, which he feels comfortable with. You know, the fact that a yogi can fly. We don't take that into account. That doesn't fit. Let's put that aside. This sort of thing. And also, they seem to ignore the definite scientific principle that you can't prove a negative. You know, they were saying, we run Jodrell Bank. These are the people who run Jodrell Bank. That's why I'm talking about the lion's mouth. They were saying, we've proved UFOs don't exist. I said, you cannot call yourself a scientist and say you've proved UFOs don't exist. We've proved that life cannot exist on the other planets of this solar system. These are terrible statements from a scientist, because all he can prove is that no one has yet amassed the correct data to prove beyond any doubt to the average man in the street, on paper, under a microscope, in whatever physical way you want, that UFOs exist. He hasn't proved they don't exist. And all they've proved about life on the other planets is that life as you and I exhibit it in a none too wonderful form, certainly speaking personally, life as we exhibit it cannot exist on the other planets. Fine, I agree with that, but they take it way beyond science to say life cannot exist. Finish, forget about it. Terribly unscientific. So, anyway, we formed, in fact, we were, as she became my wife and I, we were going to form our own society, because we got thrown out of flying saucer groups for asking about God and the yogis, and we got thrown out of spiritual groups for talking about UFOs. So we thought, what on earth are we going to do here? Well, we better write our own book and form our own society, because clearly we are the only two people on the face of the earth who are as crazy as this, you know. But it was so blindingly obvious to us that the whole thing was connected that we would not join what we would call, and I don't wish to be offensive, but a nuts and bolts UFO society, because we knew, and this is where the intuitive part comes in, if you like, a strong feeling inside. There was far more to it, because my wife had an experience with a UFO over a park in Manchester, which really convinced her of the existence of something there, which was a large pulsating orange sphere hanging over a park. And she stood transfixed looking at it. And she said she can remember as clear as day now the thoughts which went through her mind, which were, it's a weather balloon, it's a flock of geese, it's lenticular clouds, it's all the things that we'd gone through. And she ran out of it and she said, no, it's got to be a spacecraft, and there's an intelligence inside it, and it's come from another world. And at the very instant the thing took off, and she's convinced that whatever it was knew what she was thinking, which again I find very interesting from the previous speaker, that this leads you into, this is where some ufologists start getting cold feet, because you're leading into the realms of telepathy and healing and psychokinesis and this sort of thing, and a lot of people, especially the nuts and bolts people, say, no way, don't have anything to do with that, and we're going to prove it in the laboratory. You will never prove it in the laboratory, or not in one of our laboratories anyway. You won't prove the existence or the nature of UFOs in one of our laboratories. It's a lost cause. What is necessary is a leap into the dark, or the light, as we should call it, really. An intuitive leap. We went looking around many societies, and we learned some discrimination. And I will say that the UFO field's like a minefield. You know, probably not quite so lethal physically, but can be lethal mentally. We came across people, we tested motives, if you like. In other words, why do people believe in UFOs? Why do they run a certain organisation? You see, because the Consumers Association have not got around to UFO groups yet. If they did, it would make it an awful lot easier. They published a Witch magazine guide to them. Maybe it's just as well they don't. You've got to do the work to find out. We found people who really were in it because of ego. Perhaps they were a bit of a non-entity in ordinary life and got into this because they could be somebody and speak from public platforms and have articles written about them. And by the way, I don't depend on the UFO movement to speak from public platforms. I'm doing a lecture tour in Poland on industrial design in September, so get that one out of the way. There's a certain amount of madness, definitely. I've come across quite a few. In fact, I think all of us you've got to be a little bit crazy to be in this field at all, but you can be crazy in a positive way. But I mean total madness, people who are deluded and who delude others. Escapism's a great thing. People who can't cope with everyday problems escape into theories like UFOs and fringe religions. Again, it's connected even here. Financial gain in one or two places, though I've never found a way to make money out of this yet, but some people seem to. But there are some people who have a genuine belief, as I believe we did, inside, that there is something there which wants to help. There's a phenomenon and a higher intelligence which wants to help us, wants to offer aid, but believes in a code of conduct, the like of which we can only guess at. I believe, and the Aetherius Society believes, that many UFOs, certainly not all, some of them are flocks of geese, some of them are weather balloons, some are electromagnetic storms, but some of these UFOs are intelligently manned, and those intelligences are benign on the whole. If they weren't, we wouldn't be walking about in the streets at the moment. If they really wanted to colonise the earth, they'd have done it long ago. That they wish a more open contact with us, but what stops them is our reluctance to take a step towards them. And a conference such as this is a step towards them. But make no bones about it. Because they would not want to interfere with our free will. It's important we make our own minds up, in other words, in freedom and with lack of any kind of coercion. And in actual fact, the complete and utter proof, under a microscope, in mathematical terms, or whatever physical way you want to do it, of the existence of UFOs, of the existence of intelligence from outer space, is an interference with your free will. Because you're left no choice. You have to believe. You can't argue anymore. It's as much an interference with your free will as a curfew at 11 o'clock at night in a military government. You've got to make your own minds up. We feel this is part of the process. It's like a growing up sort of thing. So therefore, in the absence of Witch magazine, we've got to investigate and make our own minds up. All I can say is that when I joined the Aetherius Society, or not when I joined it, when I came across it and started being a thorn in its side, which I was for a while, and I have a lady here who was a member of the Aetherius Society long before I was, and she will vouch for the fact that I made myself quite unpopular when I came along. But the thing is that the people I met and the philosophies I came across came back undented, no matter what I could do to them. I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours investigating this one society before I decided to throw in my lot provisionally with them. And in a funny kind of way, I would say, even though I run the society in the north of England, I've still thrown my lot in provisionally, because if something better comes along, I'm off. But I feel that's not dishonest, that's not unscientific, that is very scientific. Any discovery you make, any conclusion you come to, for God's sake, make it a provisional conclusion. And then act upon it. Go do something about it. Don't just sit at home and leave it on your bookshelves. Go do something about it. Even if it's going on public platforms or going on nighttime watches or whatever it is, do something about it, because the action will bring in new experience. And then next week's conclusion will be a little different to this week's. It'll be a little more accurate, a little more advanced, a little more mature. And my beliefs now are not the same as they were a year ago. They've evolved, if you like. So anyone who says they're an expert and they know the truth, immediately be on your guard. That's another, if you like, piece of advice from 20 years of being bashed around in this movement. The Aetherius Society, as I found out, was founded in 1955. So it's quite an old organisation in flying saucer terms, 35 years old now. It believes that its founder, Sir George King, is or was a contactee, and that through that contact hundreds of messages have been received of scientific, political, religious, spacecraft activity. Information has been received. Amazing claims which have to be investigated. But the Society says at every one of its lectures, or every one that I do certainly, don't believe us, investigate. In fact, if someone comes up afterwards and said, marvellous, I think you're right, that's it, we actually hold them at arm's length and say, you come and do a few months' investigation before you say that. You're far too gullible. But the proof is there, just to give you a few examples. In the scientific field, there were warnings in 1957 of the dangers of atomic experimentation, that it would, definite statement, it would give rise to childhood leukemia, which of course brought a great deal of ridicule about our ears, but has since been proved correct. That in 1957, I think it was, there was a very serious atomic accident in Russia, near the Ural Mountains, which of course was denied, and in fact got the Aetherius Society visited by Special Branch and the Fraud Squad, because our president was rude enough to send this message to all members of Parliament and to the Russian embassy. We realise now they must have wondered where he got his information from, hence the Special Branch, because that did happen, and it came out many years later in 1976 with a Russian scientist defecting. Statements very definitely that there'd been an accident in Windscale. It's been renamed now, but Windscale it was then, the nuclear power reprocessing plant there, and the power station, that there'd been a terrible blunder and radiation had been released and that this would damage mankind. It was denied. It has since been proved true. I've got a whole wad of papers here to prove that it was true. In the political field, certainly in the late 50s, there was a very strong statement that communism would not so much be overthrown as would fall from within itself, which I don't need to say any more about that. On religious topics, the statement that the the wars between different, either mental or actual physical wars between different cults and religions were ridiculous, since all these religions came from the same root, and that root was extraterrestrial anyway. So why don't we start comparing the similarities between our religions instead of our differences? Spacecraft, there were predictions, there were something like 24 predictions of spacecraft activity, all of which 100% were corroborated, not by members of the Aetherius Society, but by independent people like airline pilots, radar operators, etc., etc. They were predicted several months in advance, all happened. Now that tends to make you sit up and think that perhaps, just perhaps, that message may have come from something to do with whatever it is that brings the UFO activity about, and it merits investigation. I found the Aetherius Society has advised, or I found out later, that it has advised the United Nations. It's written speeches for the House of Lords. I mean, this may be surprising to you, but it may be surprising to one or two newcomers that the House of Lords even has debated UFOs. But there it is, UFO sightings in Hansard. We wrote the speeches for two of the speakers there and advised them all the way through. It was instrumental in bringing the CIA and Pentagon files to this country, and publicising them, and very recently in forcing an admission from an FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, the American equivalent of the CAA in this country, forcing an admission on live television in the USA that he had been covering up about the Japan Airlines incidents over Alaska, when the aircraft was followed by a UFO for about half an hour. And we got all the documentation on this. So you may get the feeling we're not so much interested in investigating individual sightings, because by now there are enough individual sightings which have been correctly corroborated to sink the Titanic. And any more, I don't think is going to add much to the sum total of human knowledge. What we're interested in is getting the official bodies, the people that most people out there believe, rightly or wrongly, and in many cases wrongly, they believe government departments, they believe the RAF, etc. And we want to get those official bodies to come clean. We know they are not coming clean, we know they are covering up. This is not just a guess, we know it. Even if you want one proof, CIA and Pentagon papers didn't exist. Their existence was denied for many years until they were forced to release them under the US Freedom of Information Act. And we know there's an awful lot more there. We have our contacts. This was an organisation I felt interested in. It was doing things, it was active, it was also embracing, if you like, it was embracing the philosophy which I myself held, that all things were together, that the cases of people receiving healing from a contact with a UFO had something to do with the fact that Harry Edwards could heal people by the power of thought in his hands. There was a connection. We want to know what it was. The Society is interested in propounding that connection. And the return of Mr. Mantle must mean my time is drawing to a close. So I'm going to rush to a conclusion here and say, sum it up very, very quickly. We, I mean the Aetherius Society, believe that the Earth has been watched, visited and helped to the degree which the Earth has allowed for thousands of years. Not openly, because we've got free will. And two things as a concluding statement. As I've already said, for an apparent madman, I managed to run a successful business in the field of engineering and industry, where if logic failed me, it would close next week, or at least next month. And this statement I'd like to leave with you, and please take it with you. If there is the slightest chance, just the slightest chance, that I and the Aetherius Society are right, then you owe it to yourselves to expend a little effort to investigate. Try and take us apart. Because if I'm right, it makes this subject not just another hobby, not just another part-time pastime, but the most important subject on the face of the earth, which we believe it is, because it holds the key to every other subject and every other problem. If you want to investigate, you see me or the lady in the turquoise here, Hazel, afterwards. We do have a certain amount of limited information with us. Fill in a mailing list form if you want to keep in touch with us, or you want to know where to send the hate mail or whatever. And we don't hide. Please get in touch with us, and we don't have a stall here today. We were a sort of last-minute entrance, but if anybody wants talks to individual groups, we're very happy to do it. So thank you very much for your kind attention and indulgence, and hope to see some of you later. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Yes, questions.
Sure, we have a number of people that have got time for a few questions.
Your society believes that Jesus Christ lives on Venus. Can you tell us more about that?
We believe that's a bit of a statement which is not quite correct. We believe that Jesus and and some other world religion founders were extraterrestrial, and that some of them, including the Master Jesus, as we would call him, were Venusian in origin. Yes, as I've already said, we believe world religions are extraterrestrial in origin, and in fact are connected. Absolutely.
I'll ask you a question about George King himself. I understand that he hasn't actually got a knighthood. You call him Sir, but he's never been knighted in this country.
He's never been knighted by the Queen, but
that's what counts, surely.
No, it doesn't. And we're not going to go into a 6-hour lecture on chivalry, but it's well, I'll do it if Mr. Mantle will allow me. But the Queen is one source of knighthoods. Always has been, always will be. The average Briton thinks the Queen is the only source of knighthood. It is not correct under international chivalric law, which does not reside in Britain. And if you smile, it means that you have not read your chivalric law. It is quite legal. He may not use it in certain ways that a knight of the realm can use it. That's all.
John, you had a question earlier. No?
Yeah.
Plenty over here.
Given what the gentleman was saying at the front there about or yourself as well, saying that you believe that people that we have made great leaders, like Jesus Christ, made an extraterrestrial. Do you actually have a predominantly Christian element to what you do, or you're not saying that? You're just saying that some leaders that we have made so you believe were extraterrestrials, but you don't follow any particular earth religion.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. We say we wouldn't follow any particular earth religion, but probably if you boil them down to get rid of the dogma and you go back to the basic beliefs, we would follow virtually all of them. Because, I mean, just as for instance, the Buddhists and the Christians may argue with each other, but the Christian teaching, as you sow, so shall you reap, is exactly the same as the Buddhist teaching, action and reaction is opposite and equal. But you've got to get behind the words. And we believe that generally, there are some cult religions, some fringe religions which aim to gain power over people, and that is wrong. But we're talking about the mainstream religions. We believe, when you boil them down, they are basically the same. That is, you should serve other people, what you put out, you get back. There is a God, we're working towards evolution and getting closer to God. They're all the same in those basics. Some believe in reincarnation, some don't, though if I had 6 hours I'd tell you how the Christian religion wiped reincarnation out of its teachings many hundreds of years ago. So the long answer, sorry, it meant to be a short answer, is all religions, but none of them in particular.
Okay, I'm sorry we don't have time for any more questions. I'm sure Paul will be glad to speak to you in the break. If you want to have an early lunch, bearing in mind that the pubs are just about open. It's one of the only sources of nourishment on a Sunday. I understand from my colleague that lives in Sheffield that 1 or 2 of the pubs in this area do serve some rather nice food. Our next speaker after lunch, which will be around about 1:15, will be Jenny Randles. I'm sure she doesn't need an introduction. And if you'll be back in time for that, I would appreciate it. Thank you very much. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We're now going to proceed a little bit behind schedule, so I think Jenny will just talk a little bit faster, so bear with us. But I hardly need to introduce our next speaker this afternoon, but I will do anyway. She is one of the foremost researchers, if not the foremost researcher of UFOs in Great Britain. She is certainly the most prolific writer on the subject in this country. I couldn't list all her books for our ones. She is also, on top of all this, the Director of Investigations for the British UFO Research Association. And Jenny is going to present this afternoon something called the Death of UFOlogy. I'll leave you to decide what exactly that means, and please welcome Jenny Randles. Thank you.
Feels like I'm giving a sermon up here. Fine. Okay, well, with a title like that, I know that you are already expecting you're going to be in for a pretty torrid time. From some of the journalists I've spoken to this weekend, they do find it rather difficult to believe that a ufologist, someone who's been involved for as long as I have, can even think about presenting a paper with a title such as this. Consequently, I anticipate that many of you are going to have rotten tomatoes ready. Certainly if you reacted as you did to Andy Roberts yesterday. But I want to say before we start 3 things which are important. Firstly, that I'm not an outsider. As many of you know, I have been within the UFO field now for quite some time, and I've interviewed hundreds of witnesses who've had experiences. Secondly, that I'm not a debunker. I do not want to dismiss the UFO phenomenon from existence at all costs. And I'm certainly not paid by anybody to do that, if anybody who are harbouring thoughts. If anybody knows the address of how you apply for that job, I'd love to know. I'm also not a sceptic, in the sense that I am dismissive of the reality of these phenomena. I believe the witnesses, in the vast majority of cases, are telling the truth, that they are sincere, they're describing what they believe has happened to them. Our job as honest ufologists is to try to evaluate that information and find out a workable explanation for the things that are happening to them. So bear those riders in mind when you realise that I'm going to be talking about something called the Death of UFOlogy. It is a provocative title. It's deliberately a provocative title. It's 95% serious, maybe 5% slightly flippant. But there are undercurrents to it which I think are important, and I hope will come out over the next hour. I'm going to divide this into 3 basic sections. First of all, an introduction on the UFO phenomenon in general. Then we'll move on to the mysterious phenomenon of the crop circles. And then we'll look at the possible way in which those 2 might interrelate. So firstly, let's briefly recap some of the things that we've actually seen, if I can get this wonderful device to work, over the past couple of days. The UFO phenomenon. Essentially, at the moment, there are 3 different ways of looking at the UFO phenomenon. What you might call the American interpretation is this. It's not totally confined just to America, there are many people in this room who probably accept it. And that is, of course, that we're dealing with alien entities who are performing some kind of experimentation on Earth and abducting people, as this scene from the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind shows. It is certainly a valid interpretation of the evidence before us, and we shouldn't dismiss it on the grounds of total impossibility or anything like that. It differs markedly from the attitude that you would find in, say, most of Europe, what we might call the European perspective, which is that the UFO phenomenon is essentially something that is in the mind of the witness, either a psychological experience, or a few avant-garde Europeans might go as far as to say that it's some kind of strange form of hallucination. So it maybe is slightly parapsychological, but mostly psychological. In Britain, we have a sort of middle ground approach, which basically says that we are dealing with what amounts to a natural phenomenon. We've even invented the term UAP, which stands for Unidentified Atmospheric Phenomenon, to try and obscure the roots of the phenomenon within the alien abduction hypothesis and so on. And other people have come up with other names. You'll be hearing later from Paul Devereaux about Earthlights, which is as good a name as any. There's a chap called Hilary Evans, I don't know whether he's here today, who's invented the term BOLS, which, if you say it quickly enough, some people think is a perfect description of ufology. The idea of this sort of British perspective is that we are dealing with real things, and that the real things are slightly more mundane than alien spaceships, and that they trigger more exotic experiences in some way or another. So, as you can see, there are three fairly different ways of looking at the evidence, and we don't know which of them is right. You don't know which of them is right. Many of you have come here today, maybe because you've had an experience and you want to try and understand what has happened to you, or what you've read about in the newspapers or seen on television. And you can't judge between these three. You just have your own feelings and viewpoints based on what you think is the most likely, which is fair enough. However, there is a problem which emerges from what we might call a sort of battlefront situation that has developed. There are definitely tensions that are created by it. Let's look at a particular case. This happened in Australia in January 1988. And very briefly, family were driving across country from Perth to Adelaide overnight when they encountered something ahead of them on the road, which was basically a little more than a light initially, but was seen with some structure and shape, and was moving about from side to side, and ultimately they felt was directly on top of the car, although they didn't see it. And some strange things happened to them. Their voices started to change pitch. There was a strange smell inside the car. A mysterious powder appeared inside the car. And then there was a force which appeared to lift them up off the road temporarily and then dump them back down again. In UFO terms, it's what we would call a close encounter. What is interesting is that the witnesses, when they were talking about this experience, described it in very rational terms. Strange forces, something lifting us off the road, this funny light, and so on. They didn't make any real presumptions. The real presumptions came later when the media got hold of the story. And within a matter of hours, certainly within a couple of days, it was spread around the world with headlines like "The Pong from Outer Space," which was one British tabloid. Another one actually said that a strange force from space had destroyed the car. There were actually a couple of dents on the roof. That was the sum total of the damage. But you can see the way in which the exaggeration occurred. And why did it occur like that? Where did the idea that the Pong came from outer space come from? I mean, there was nothing within the testimony of the witnesses which said that. They'd seen a funny light and it had done something real to the car. But why from space? From the sky, yes, but why space? And it's because of this widespread belief that ufology and alien spaceships and so on are interrelated. You can almost interchange the terms. And it does create really deep problems, both for ufologists and for witnesses. For instance, we had a situation a couple of years ago when we were organising a series of charity events for the ITV telethon. And we were lucky enough to get the cooperation of Jodrell Bank, who allowed the local group in Manchester to organise a series of events, exhibitions, lectures in the planetarium, which were incredibly successful. We actually were contracted to do one. So many people turned up, we ended up having to do about half a dozen. But our very serious attempts to bring the truth about ufology to the general public in that way were nearly scuppered at the last minute, thanks to the media. who, over the weeks preceding this, had published a lot of their usual stories about aliens and UFOs and spaceships. And it had led to a sort of vigilante group of scientists contacting the Jodrell Bank and telling them, what are you doing associating yourselves with all this UFO tosh? And we literally had to go through an inspection from Professor Sir Graham Smith before we were allowed to put on our display and satisfy him that we weren't doing anything silly and we were really quite rational, normal, sensible people. We could have lost the opportunity not only to make a lot of money for charity, but to express the realities of the UFO phenomenon out, all because of the way in which it's evaluated. Another instance, a year or so ago I was contacted by a woman who's an education welfare officer. She wanted some help in trying to get a young girl back to school because she'd actually been off school for months after she'd had a UFO sighting. It was a fairly straightforward thing. She'd seen this funny object in the sky. It had done something to a transistor radio. Relatively common experience. She naively had talked to someone who told a newspaper and it had appeared in one of the tabloids. She then faced enormous ridicule at school because they'd written it up in the usual style of spaceships and aliens and this girl is being focused on by aliens and so on. And it had allowed her to have doubts about continuing to go to school and therefore severely jeopardised her education. And she had to be worked with very carefully to coerce her back. So, as I say, it's not an artificial academic thing. It has real effects. There was even a case I noticed in the newspapers only a few days ago about a woman in Sussex who'd actually been scarred for life by someone she was living with because of a row over UFOs appearing over their house. So it does generate real dilemmas within society. And therefore it's not just something we can dismiss lightly by saying that, okay, we have to accept it as a fact of life, that UFOs are presumed to be spaceships and this phenomenon is presumed to be the only one that's valid and there's nothing we can do about it. In fact, we have sort of several facts of life about ufology which we've put together, which I'll go very briefly through. Fact of life number one is that basically 95% of all reported UFO experiences are not UFOs at all. They're things like this. That's, in fact, an aeroplane heading straight towards the camera by some chap who was standing on the end of the runway at Manchester Airport. I think he's still with us. And he managed to get the full glare of the headlight coming at you. And this does cause many misperceptions. You can see things like that, particularly in the middle of the night, from 30 or 40 miles away. The lights are so bright. And therefore, the light will appear to remain stationary for maybe 5 minutes. And you can understand how people unfamiliar with a major airport would not know what they're looking at. Things like this, a photograph of a series of UFOs taken out of an aircraft window, which in the end turned out to be nothing but, some of you may find hard to believe, the tail fin of the aeroplane distorted by the two sheets of perspex forming the window and some peculiarities of optics and physics. There was no real object in the sky, but it was real enough to be photographed, as you can see. And things like this. These are stills from a movie film, or two separate bits of movie film taken in crop circle territory in Wiltshire, not far from Stonehenge. There is no doubt, had this piece of film been taken in the recent years rather than about 12 years ago, how it would now be being evaluated by the media all over the world as evidence of the UFOs causing the crop circles. And it was a very difficult case to investigate and evaluate. But in the end, we were forced to conclude that what these witnesses were seeing and designing a very elaborate story around, which they may or may not have believed, was in fact nothing more than military flares being dropped to Earth on parachutes, lining up in apparent formations. So many UFOs, the majority of UFOs, some skeptics say all UFOs, I categorically don't say that, are not UFOs at all. They're what we call IFOs. And you can never forget that fact, because if 95% of your evidence turns out to be mistaken identity, if the chances are more than 9 to 1 against that any witness who says they've seen a UFO really hasn't seen a UFO, you would be naive in the extreme not to take that into account. Second fact of life is that society has an image of the UFO ingrained within their minds, built up over the years by movies and television and newspapers and so on, and that this is actually responsible for creating craft. You may find that hard to believe, but it's true. On New Year's Eve 1978, thousands of people all over this country, there may well be people in this audience, saw a UFO, described it usually as a cigar-shaped craft with windows or lights on the side. There was no craft there. We know for certain what this was. It was a spaceship. It was not a spaceship from Mars, it was a spaceship from the Soviet Union, which was re-entering the Earth's atmosphere and burning up as a trail of gas and clouds and debris. And because of our desire as human beings to put things in order, we'd actually invented a shape around this. We'd seen the glowing bits of unconnected debris as lights or windows on a craft. We had produced the craft in our mind from bits of debris that weren't there. And it does happen. Here's another example of it. These are slides. The top two and the bottom one on the left there are all slides for the illustrations drawn by three witnesses who were in a car travelling through the Lincolnshire area. In fact, one of the investigators here today, Nigel, and he will tell you that they were very convinced of their experience. They were frightened about this thing that was following the car, and they had seen a fairly constructed shape around it. The other one was someone else who'd locally seen something similar. The fact of the matter is that they hadn't seen any craft at all. The two lights, big bright lights, are the thing which are consistent to all the sketches, as you can see. And they're the only things that were actually there. It was one star and one planet which happened to be close together in the sky in some astronomical conjunction. The witnesses had invented the shape around everything else because of our commitment to the belief that UFOs are craft, and our desire as human beings, totally natural, to read artificial design and shapes into things which are not artificially designed. And we can see this all the time in the evidence, in the way in which, if you just, for instance, look at reports of abduction experiences from the records, UFO records from 40 years ago, and compare them with technology as it stood then, you'll see that the aliens used very cumbersome equipment, clunking number dials and computers the size of rooms, the sort of thing we had then. If you look at the reports now, they have holograms and lasers, but they didn't have those before we did. The technology tracks our own. Now, there is a reason for that, obviously, and a reason you have to take into account if you're going to evaluate these stories. We saw yesterday about how the aliens come in such a wide variety of shapes and sizes that it's very difficult to understand how we can be being visited by so many different races. And also, you find the problems like, see that one on the bottom right there, sort of figure floating in the air and it being almost non-existent, it sort of tends to fade away into vapour at points. You can well understand how that would have been interpreted as a ghost in other circumstances. We enforce the implication that it's a spaceman onto the story because of modern society. Something is happening, witnesses are having strange experiences, but to assume that they are alien is an assumption, and we have to accept that. It may be a correct assumption, but it nevertheless is a presumption. We also have a problem, which Andy touched on very well yesterday, about how the phenomenon is evaluated according to the culture of the day. And we're going to find that too within the crop circle phenomenon. This is an interesting illustration of the way in which the mind can manipulate the phenomenon. You look at the formation here, we have what supposedly is a Celtic Cross, according to the media stories and some of the investigators. It does vaguely look like a Celtic Cross, with the cross shape and the stem at the bottom. But in actual fact, it's difficult to say that, because if you look at the bottom one here, you see it's slightly out of true with everything else. So forget about that one, and we've got a classic crop circle formation of a quintuplet, a big central one, 4 outer wings, with one which just coincidentally happens to be somewhere near it. And we in our mind have produced a Celtic Cross out of it, because we want to produce some sort of meaningful pattern. And that kind of thing is happening all the time, within ufology as well as within crop circle research, and it's something we have to guard against. You just can't pretend these things aren't there, however much we want to look for order and pattern within the data. So when I put problems like this across, and I'm interviewed by journalists, for instance, they find it quite incredulous that I can be sort of saying these sort of things and still be involved. They usually say, "Why are you dispirited that you've disproved UFO?" I haven't disproved anything. I'm just putting forward the facts, and you have to put those facts together and work out for yourself what's going on. And to me, as an investigator of UFO reports, finding an explanation for a case is a triumph, not a disaster. I mean, I'm not here to prove that aliens are invading us. I'm here to find out what's going on. And if that means sometimes, maybe often, you can find out what's going on is more mundane, not always, but often, then that isn't a cause for being dispirited. It's a cause for being glad that we're doing our job in the right way and correctly. And, I would encourage everybody who investigates UFO reports to regard an explained case as something that they should be proud of. And hopefully the witnesses will treat it in the same way. They don't always, of course, because they suffer from the same problems as we do. They are conditioned by society to want their experience to be something more. And it seems to them that you're almost calling them incompetent if they've misperceived something. That is not true at all, because these experiences happen to everybody within society, however skilled and trained. So it is by no means anything demeaning of an individual to say that they have misperceived a UFO, because there are many strange and puzzling things up there in the skies. That's almost a direct quote from the Ministry of Defence, and you don't always agree with the Ministry of Defence, neither do I. That's one of the things I happen to agree with them on. And there is no disgrace in not understanding what's flying around your heads. It helps you learn things about the universe. So in other words, because ufology in a way is a hopeless mess which is contaminated by belief systems and structures and impositions from outside, particularly by the media, that's why I pose the question, is it time that we as ufologists accepted that we're basically on a lost cause? That by trying to persuade people to listen to us without them making these presumptions about spaceships and aliens, are we in fact doing something wrong? Are we in fact wasting our time? Well, in 50 years' time we'll still be doing the same thing. If we sit down now and say, yes, in 50 years' time we will still be doing it, then we may as well accept that fact and say, right, we have to make a fundamental change now. Otherwise, why do we carry on for the next 50 years? I believe, in my own mind, that is what's going to happen. And because of that, I think we have to now think about making this fundamental change. If that's true, the next question we have to ask is, who is it that we are trying to persuade as UFO investigators? There are two possibilities. That is, society as a whole. The second is professionals within the relevant fields, psychology, sociology, physics, meteorology, geophysics, whatever, plus probably many others, that may be relevant to the work that we're doing. If it's society, we're probably wasting our time. In fact, I'm sure we're wasting our time, because I know from experience that society, which is represented by the media, does not want to be convinced. It wants to be convinced of what it wants to be convinced of, and that is aliens. And we are never going to affect public opinion in any fundamental, important way at all. Therefore, I think we should forget that, not even try to do that, and we should concentrate on the other aspect, that is persuading professionals in relevant fields that there is something important going on here, that they are making a crucial mistake by ignoring this information from genuine, sincere people who are having experiences which cry out to be understood. So, I don't think we're going to do that by continuing as ufologists, because ufologists aren't they, interested in spaceships? Everybody says that. Scientists say that, and you have to spend half your time getting to know them and convincing them that you're not doing that. Consequently, maybe, I am proposing, should we not abandon ufology, accept that it as a workable hypothesis, it's dead, it's a failed model, and work together with professionals in the relevant fields to start from scratch, create something new. I don't know what we'd call it, I mean, it doesn't really matter. Maybe because we're studying atmospheric anomalies, we could call it atmosanity. I don't know, that's just not meant to be taken too seriously. But that is a proposal that I am making for you to think about. Maybe not people who've had the experiences, but certainly the people in this room, and there are many of them, who are UFO researchers. I know are committing a lot of hard time and effort into doing the work which they have to recognise that they're doing for a reason, and think about what that reason is. Ufology really splits up into a variety of normal areas of science. And one of our problems in the past has been believing that we are something different, something unique, something that is wonderfully, earth-shatteringly important. Ufologists have got wonderful egos. It's the greatest thing to do to become a ufologist if you want to be a big fish in a little pond and have your name plastered all over the newspapers. So if anybody fancies that out there, BUFORA membership forms are available out there. But seriously, ufology really isn't like that. It's a series of phenomena which come from many different areas, which are gathered together in a kind of umbrella, which we've called UFOs since we've invented the term. And maybe it's better to now redefine it as these other phenomena. Let's split it up into the parts that it's relevant to. We know, for instance, that it's very relevant to geophysics, and I won't touch upon that because Paul Devereux is going to be covering this extensively later on this afternoon. But there is clearly very important contributions to be made by geophysical science, and it explains many of the things that we're seeing. There are definitely light phenomena in the atmosphere generated by some source which are flying around all over the world and are focusing at key locations, what we call window areas. That is an undeniable fact from the evidence. And any scientists here who dispute that, then they can happily discuss this with ufologists and they will be able to prove it to you beyond a shadow of a doubt. It is criminal that universities around this country are not focusing their resources on locations where we can guarantee them that for a very short period of time and investiture of money and expenditure and equipment, they could get hard, solid proof that would convince other scientists that these things are real. That is not a statement that I'm making boldly. That is a statement of absolute fact based upon the experiences that are going on. But what these things are when they're seen, that's a typical photograph of a sort of squiggle of light, ball of light taken near Halifax. What these things are is the subject for Paul Devereux to discuss. But what is interesting is that how we evaluate them. We look at that and we say, somebody's photographed a spaceship over West Yorkshire. Because they haven't. They photographed a light over West Yorkshire. What caused the light is what we are here to do. And you can also understand why lights in the sky can be the cause of many different strange experiences. In a book that I recently wrote called Mind Monsters, there's a case where basic light phenomena are evaluated by the witnesses as something quite different. They're actually evaluated by them as what we might call ninja dwarves, who are doing various things in a local estate or grounds. They'd seen lights which to other people would have been UFOs. To them there was something different because there was a different sociological context and a different set of criteria for the witnesses, which led on to a very strange experience with these ninja warriors that were floating around. So all I'm saying is that we have to understand that people are seeing real things, and that is the point where we have to stop, because that's the point where the hard evidence stops. Beyond that, we are evaluating it in different ways, and it's really basically the investigation that produces the evidence after that. The witness produces the evidence up to a certain level. After that, according to whichever direction you go in terms of trying to evaluate it and in terms of trying to investigate it, you, as ufologists, are as responsible for the format of the data as the witness, probably more responsible. Again, we have to understand that. Second area of science which is very relevant to the study of UFOs and which we could sort of splinter off is meteorology or atmospheric physics. There are several types of what I call unidentified atmospheric phenomena created by different processes within the atmosphere which are not understood by science. They are new things. Science could make discoveries, make progress by looking at them. And we owe it to ourselves as a society, and we owe it to science to make them understand that fact and get them involved. But it isn't easy. These are photographs of stills from the pt.2 movie film. You see the orange blob in the middle there between the trees. I think it's slightly better on the next one. Over the trees to the top right there. Piece of movie film of this orange light moving across the sky, seen not just by the guy who got 22 seconds of movie film here in Buckinghamshire, but also by two other groups of independent witnesses at other locations. There is no doubt at all in this case, we have proof beyond any shadow of a doubt that this orange blob was there. We don't know what the orange blob was, we can't come up with any real rational explanations for it. It's some kind of strange force, effect, energy, whatever. I know because I tried very hard to persuade scientists to take this seriously. With the great help from Kodak, who made facilities available in London, we showed this film to a gathering of atmospheric physicists from leading universities, research establishments such as Harwell, all over the country. They came along to try and figure out what this film showed. None of them could. We then offered them the piece of film to take home with them to study it in their laboratories. None of them would. Why? Because their basic argument was, we have to apply for research grants every year. If we were to take this piece of movie film back and we were said to be discussing spaceships, we'd never get another grant in our lives. It is again the social dilemma which prevents the hard evidence from really being assessed by scientists, and it's our responsibility to do something about that. And thirdly, there is an area of thinking that abnormal psychology or parapsychology, whatever you want to call it, is another area which will benefit from looking at some of the UFO data. Certainly there are interesting cases where clues emerge. A case from America where the witness are describing an abduction experience, and at one point they just make a comment like, the aliens were talking to me and they were using a voice which was my thinking voice. Now, that's a clue which you immediately think, now why was this communication in the same voice that the person uses when they think to themselves? It wasn't them inventing the experience. It wasn't them believing that the aliens were there. There's something else happening here which we don't understand. But little clues like that indicate that the witness is the focal point of the experience and needs, therefore, to be more fully understood by professionals in the relevant fields. And we have a responsibility to get them involved, of course, therefore. We can talk about a couple of cases which generalise and summarise some of these experiences. A case which Roy Sandbach and I looked at quite recently, from not too far from here, a place called Walsden, near Todmorden. Very impressive because it involves one of these window area locations where UFOs are appearing all of the time. And there is no doubt that if you go there with a camera, stay there for a couple of weeks, you'll see one, because they're just so frequent. This woman, who was at the time on the moors with her dog, basically had seen these lights coming across the sky and splitting up and shooting apart in all different directions for several weeks leading up to the experience, which happened, incidentally, some years ago, although it's only just been reported. And they may well be relevant to Paul Devereaux's work, which you'll hear about later. Could well be that they were Earth lights. However, the main experience was even stranger because she was suddenly alerted to the presence of this thing by the dog, who realised it was there. It was looking up at the sky. It stopped in the middle of its tracks and looked. Now, dogs don't normally do that, and so therefore she looked. And there was this thing shaped like a sort of lozenge, a lens, surrounded by a glowing aura, pouring out light, yet light which wasn't illuminating the ground, despite this being almost close enough that she could have reached up and touched it. Totally silent. She says that, but for the reaction of the dog, it would have been there above her head and she wouldn't have known, because she wouldn't have looked at the sky. And many other strange things happened within this experience. Basically, she had a, to borrow a phrase from Whitley Strieber, a communion with it. She felt a oneness with the thing. And there were many other bizarre aspects of the sort of psychology or parapsychology of the encounter. Oz factor state took over, time started to stretch out and have no relevance or meaning. And she felt as if there was some sort of a communication going on, information being channeled to her saying, do not be afraid, we're not going to harm you. That sort of message conveyed, but not in words, in images and symbols. And in fact, it was a quite remarkable experience on many different levels. And it's the sort of close encounter that happens all the time and is magical and mysterious rather than rational and scientific. And that is our problem. We don't understand it, but we do therefore try to invent explanations for it. But the truth is we don't really have explanations. We just have to accept the bafflement of the experience. Another case like this one, this is a sketch made by a chap called Ken Edwards, Risley in Cheshire, who basically was driving along on his car when this thing came out of the hedgerow by the side of the road. And he interpreted it as a figure. Others might say it was a ghost. It was basically just a glowing mass of energy which poured out light from what he called its eyes and struck his car with interesting consequences. He was a service engineer. He had an expensive radio transceiver which literally blew up. There was a tremendous power surge through the aerial and the diodes, and the thing was wrecked. His watch stopped. Some sort of magnetisation stopped it. He had burn marks on the inside of his fingers in the parts that were exposed to the glare, but not the parts which were in shade and shadow. Without any doubt at all, some real energy force generated this experience. It was a terrifying amount of energy. The sort of experience that if someone was walking across the moors and they got struck by lightning would happen. And whether relevant or not, this guy actually died. He contracted 2 different kinds of cancer and died not long afterwards, while he was still very young. It may be a coincidence, it may not. But certainly he was unfortunate enough to come into close proximity with some tremendous energy. And we have imposed our interpretation on what that energy is. We say it was an alien, that there was a spaceship probably hiding somewhere behind the bushes that he never saw. And we would say, right, let's take him along to a doctor and have him hypnotised, and let's see if we can find out what really happened. Because there was a period of time which he couldn't account for. There was a missing time period. He was never hypnotised. We don't know what would have happened if he had been, but I think we can make a very good guess. But would that have been the truth? Or is the truth just what he's told us, and anything else is something that we are inventing by the techniques of investigation that we are using? We don't know the answer to that question, but it is nevertheless a very important, valid question we have to ask. I think that we can show that we have some criteria for the phenomenon that we're trying to find. We can sort of put an identikit picture of the missing UFO, if you like, that produces these strange cases. We tend to have the right person, because there are peculiarities about witnesses to close encounter experiences which we've been able to isolate by studying many of them. They're, for instance, very often artistic, visually creative, and have a track record throughout their lives of strange paranormal experiences. They have poltergeists in their house, they have floating dreams, out-of-body experiences, and so on and so forth. There is this record very prominent throughout their lives. These people tend to be at the right place in certain locations which we call window areas, often in hilly locations, the early hours of the morning. There does seem to be a relationship with frontal systems passing over, which may trigger them into existence. And the thing that they see is fairly consistent as well. It's usually sort of spinning top shaped or domed or oval or something like that. It can very often be said to be humming or buzzing. It usually rotates. There are instances which show that there is a massive ionization generated by it. It can cause impedance on car engines and lighting systems and cause other effects from ionizing radiation, both on witnesses and on animals and on the environment. So we have, if you like, been able very easily to build up an identikit of this. Here's just some brief examples of... there's a case from Florida where you can see the radiation apparently was able to burn holes in the guy's cap and was able to scorch the grass at the site, but in a very strange way. It was the roots that were burnt, but not the tops of the grass. The radiation, whatever it was, worked like a microwave, cooking from the outside in. And we have a number of cases where that same effect has been noticed. So microwave radiation is obviously some component of whatever energy is involved in these things. There's a classic car stop case from Nelson in Lancashire. Two people saw this thing over their car. The engine and lights cut out completely while it was over their heads. When it flew away, they both worked again on their own. Very many physiological sensations were associated with this. They felt a pressure pushing down on them from above, a sound like the rushing of wind or the tide out at sea. Their hair stood on end as if exposed to a sort of tingling electrostatic field, like if you put your arm against a television set that's been switched off. The hairs are attracted to it. That's an electrostatic charge which is doing that. It's exactly what they felt. They were within an electrostatic field generated by something. We may even have photographs of it. There's a photograph of something taken over Trindade Island in the Atlantic of what might be one of these ionised blobs in the atmosphere. It's a fuzzy thing. It's not a totally structured thing. We can, if you like, see that as a spaceship, but that's exactly what it looked like. It's not an effect of the photograph or the grain or anything. It was described by the witnesses as basically Saturn-shaped or spinning top-shaped, but fuzzy, composed of a sort of mass of fuzzy particles. Is it an ionisation field which is gathering together charged particles from the atmosphere, dust or whatever, into that shape, and that's producing the visible UFO? And if it's seen at night, it glows. We don't know, but we have reason to think maybe it is from the way we're putting this identikit together. Okay, let's forget about UFOs temporarily and look at crop circles now. The crop circle phenomenon may at first sight seem to have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with UFOs. It's said to have been begun in 1980 if you sort of evaluate it in its modern sense. Although many people won't even realise it goes back that far because they'll have only read about it in their newspapers or seen television reports over the last couple of years. But as far as Britain is concerned, and inventing the term crop circles and studying it as a separate issue, it goes back to 1980 when crop circles like this one turned up in Wiltshire. This is just one of the circles which appeared in a field below the base of the White Horse Hill there. That's the inside of that initial circle, looking up at the hill with the big white horse on it at Westbury in Wiltshire. And it was studied with interest by a local UFO group and by a scientist who happened also to be interested from his own perspective, and they mutually ultimately agreed on a possible causation for it. It did have some national attention. It made one national magazine called Now, a story in there. But for some reason or other, it didn't excite the British public and it didn't really take off. But crop circle events continued to happen over the next few years. And we started to get new formations. Crop circles circa 1982, when the ufologist who'd originally been involved, Ian Masriglod, wrote up an article for a magazine called The Unexplained, explaining to people what he and this scientist thought was going on. And by then, as you can see, we had single circles in the corn, perfectly flattened, swirled in the centre, sharply delineated edges, looking to be artificial, but as I've already told you from UFOs, learn the lesson, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be artificial. Think also about things like snowflakes, when you look at them under a microscope, and the beautiful intricate patterns of design there. You could say they're artificially designed by God, but that's about as far as you can go. They're certainly not the product of aliens. So nature can and does work in intricate designs. And we had up to things like what we called a triplet, big central circle and two little satellites on the outside. Still, according to the people who were studying it, fitted in with the theory, nobody was particularly worried. Within the centre, you see a close-up there of the sort of swirled pattern in the centre of a typical circle. Or in a ring, that's a ring, which is different from circle. Rather than the whole thing being flattened like that circle on the left is, on the right you just have the corn in the middle standing up perfectly straight, but a little band or ring around the outside where it's swirled, flattened. And the rings started to appear, but we were able to show quite conclusively by looking back at historical data that they hadn't suddenly started to appear at all. They'd actually been reported prior to 1980, as had the circles, but nobody formed a phenomenon out of them, given them a name, and therefore nobody, except in some cases the local newspapers, had done anything about them. It was the excitement of the creation of the term crop circle and the development of a hook onto which you could in future put all the circle reports, which had led to the implication that there was now an escalating phenomenon. There wasn't. Certainly not at that stage anyway. But there were also anomalies, little curious things like these. This is a spur. You can see that little prong coming out, so it looks like a bit like a spyglass on the left-hand side there, from a ringed circle. That is a circle in the centre with a ring around it. And the spur in this instance, as you can see, goes right across the tram line. Tram lines are just lines left by farm equipment as they go in and out of the field, so they don't make a total mess of the crop. They use the same tram lines again and again, and it limits the damage to the crop. And the effect, whatever it was, that caused the spur had actually gone right along the tram line. So it was puzzling and curious, but nevertheless, again, it wasn't a new effect, because in actual fact the 1980 circles in Westbury had a little spur as well. So even that was not a new effect. But it's in the last couple of years when things have really gone potty, and we've now literally been invaded by these circles. And there's been a dramatic increase. From years up until about 1988, we were talking about 30, 40, 50 circles a year in a good year. Last year there were 303. There's already been over 300 this summer. It is rising like a rocket, and there's obviously an explanation for that. But it is that rise which has given rise to the number of media stories about it. I mean, there have been, I've counted them, 125 separate press stories about crop circles, most of them in major newspapers, since the beginning of June this year. Extraordinary hype. And there was a similar number last year. Everybody is excited by the phenomenon and have discovered it as if it's just recently happened. Of course, there is probably a relationship between the amount of publicity and the amount of circles that are appearing. Paul Fuller did a survey on behalf of BUFORA a couple of years ago in which he looked at the probable incident rate of crop circles by surveying farmers in one county to see whether they'd had crop circles in the past, how many, what type, what they thought of them, and so on. And that showed conclusively that many crop circles weren't being reported because farmers were afraid of publicity, didn't want people traipsing all over their fields and destroying their livelihood. Therefore, they didn't tell anybody about them, but they were occurring. And we could produce a sort of figure for the number of crop circles which were appearing every summer, and it was a relatively small one. They should be spread around the country, of course, and there were crop circles from other parts of the country. They weren't just confined to Hampshire and Wiltshire, where a lot of them are, where there happened also to be a lot of cereal fields, so that was obviously important because that's the medium which records these things very well. But they were also in other counties, and they were usually ignored when they happened in other counties because the media had invented the term the Wessex Triangle. That was actually invented in 1983 by the Daily Express. And of course it was wonderful because they'd given a new angle to the thing, produced the specialness of the area around Wessex, where there are all these places like Stonehenge and Avebury, and a lot of esoteric groups and cults and hippies go there every summer around the time when the circles appear. It was a lovely story angle, and it's grown from that. But it was an artificial creation, and it's also led, of course, to people going there looking for circles, a lot of local media attention. People are bound to find more circles there because they're looking for them more often. And it was predictable that once the thing became a big national story, circles would start to appear outside of Hampshire and Wiltshire, as they have, that more circles would be found because genuine ones would be found, and of course, inevitably, that people would start to hoax them for the fun of it, for the publicity, or for other motives, we don't know. But that certainly happened too. And anybody who thinks you can't hoax crop circles, I'm afraid, is sadly mistaken. It is completely possible to do that, and it has happened on a number of proven occasions. But I'll come to that in a minute. What is the explanation for these things? Of course, now we realise that we have so many of them, we do have to explain them. We can't just write them off as a little bit of an anomaly. There's something which has now excited the whole country and the world. One of the early suggestions was that maybe it was just helicopters that were doing it, flying over the field, but that's been proven to be completely impossible by a number of experiments, the first of which BUFORA suggested as long ago as about 4 or 5 years was carried out. It's been duplicated now several times. It cannot happen. Helicopters do not produce perfect circles. They just lead to a mess, basically, in the field. So that's out. The idea of hoaxing, of course, appealed to a lot of people because they thought, oh, well, yes, obviously someone's just having a bit of fun here, particularly if they're turning up mostly in these areas where there are all these strange groups of people, and where in the 1960s the UFO centre of the universe was, Warminster. Circles are appearing all around Warminster, and some people found that very suspicious. Perhaps Warminster's lost its popularity. People aren't going there to look for UFOs anymore like they used to, and now instead they're going there to look for circles, and someone may be connected with the local tourist industry, even it was suggested, although there's no evidence for that, was in some way responsible for, that's what a good idea to get Warminster back on the map. But I mean, that sort of thought crossed people's minds, although of course they didn't have any evidence for it. But can it be done? Yes, it can be done. This is an example of someone having created a hoax circle for the BBC cameras. As you can see, it looks just like a real one. There's swirling and there's flat crop at the edges. There are some subtle differences if you look very closely, but basically, to the untrained eye, it looks exactly like the circles that are appearing. And hoaxing is a very real factor which cannot be ruled out. We do know of a number of proven cases where hoaxes happened, where many of the so-called experts in crop circle research have not spotted them. And that's obviously worrying. If the experts don't know that they're hoaxed or real, we have to take that into account. Inevitably, because of the strangeness, the artificialness and so on of them, it led to claims that we were dealing with something much more peculiar, esoteric in nature. People link them with things like Stonehenge, near where the circles are appearing. The shape looks similar. It looks like a crop circle, doesn't it? Why? Some people think maybe it's possible that there is a sort of symbolic element here. Aliens or other intelligences are trying to pass messages on to us. Maybe also you could equally say that if crop circles are caused by some other process, a natural force for instance, that it's always been present, and that even thousands of years ago the people who lived in the area occasionally saw it, and they thought too, like we do now, that it was some sign from some other intelligence. The gods, to them, our gods are wearing spacesuits, but it's the same thing nevertheless. And so they would build their temples in the form of the marks left in the fields. It's a possibility, you can't rule it out, but I mean, obviously it's this kind of speculation that went on. Well, in the early days, someone even suggested that when we only had a few circles, some of them were turning up at Warminster, some of them were turning up at Westbury, some of them were turning up at Wantage in Oxfordshire, 3 letters all beginning with the letter W, and that was obviously a message. I mean, you can go on doing this sort of thing forever if you want to, but I mean, to me, it's just a silly way of evaluating the data. You've got to look at the facts, not try and invent the facts to fit in with what you're trying to do. Just as an example of the extremity of that, I've got some photographs. I haven't got them on slides because I only just got them back from ordinary prints, but anybody who's interested, I'll show them to later on today, of a ring which turned up a couple of weeks ago at a place called Pever in Cheshire, near Knutsford, which achieved quite a lot of publicity, allegedly as the first circle. It wasn't a circle, it was a ring, but the first circle to have appeared in Cheshire. It wasn't the first circle to appear in Cheshire by a long way, and it's not the only site in Cheshire which generates circles. There are about 4 of them known. But nevertheless, despite all that, it turned up, it gained a lot of publicity, which seems to have begun with a story phoned anonymously to the well-known, intensely credible newspaper, The Sport. Whether or not you find that a suspicious factor as I do is up to you, but there are a number of other features about this circle, this ring, that I'm dubious about. But nevertheless, what was interesting was you could play name games with it if you wanted to. The word Pever is actually spelt P-E-O-V-E-R. The O is silent, it's pronounced Pever. So maybe the O fell down on the ground and produced the O, which was the ring. It's actually also right by a place called Fuller's Gate. Paul Fuller, who's one of the main crop circle researchers, is here today, and found that most amusing. Is this just us looking for things within the data, finding fairies in the trees? If you look at the patterns of light and shade, you can imagine that there's a little fairy there in the branches. That sort of thing is human nature, so we don't know, but maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just something that hoaxers are doing, deliberately playing name games. We had one instance last summer where a circle turned up in Essex, and there was a lot of media speculation about it, and one report said, are these the product of little green men? A couple of days later, another circle turned up nearby at a village called Littley Green. Coincidence or somebody having a good laugh? It's up to you to judge. I think I know what I believe. However, I do also believe that there is something responsible for the patterns, basically. This is not just a hoax. It can't be, for one very important reason. It isn't just a recent event. It dates back a long, long way. Andy showed you yesterday the woodcutting from 1678 about crop circles in Hertfordshire. We have many other examples of cases going back a long way too. Certainly to the early part of this century. We have many other cases predating 1980. We have cases all over the world. 22 countries are now known to have produced crop circles in documented cases that were recorded at the time, not just recent anecdotes of, oh yeah, my friend once saw one of them things in a field. That's no good to us, of course, because it's after the fact. So this is a real phenomenon of some sort, no doubt, and it's a long-standing phenomenon, which to me suggests that it has to be some sort of natural process, because otherwise, if it was aliens, they're not getting very far in their message telling, are they? They've spent 300 years doing it, and they haven't got through to us yet. I think they better go on to semaphore or smoke signals. They might get through a bit better. So what is this natural force then that's causing it? The theory which was initially proposed by that scientist and by the UFO group back in 1980 was that it was something to do with the weather. Now, I know that sounds bizarre. How can the weather produce something like this? Well, I don't know. There's the swirl pattern we're talking about in a typical sort of circle. There's a swirl pattern produced by the weather in the centre of a hurricane. There is a degree of similarity, isn't there? So, superficially at least, we have to take this seriously. Air vortexes, or air vortices, they are a possible cause for this thing. But you find it very hard to get out of this binding thing in your mind that says, how can the weather, the wind, produce something as beautiful, intricately designed as one of these crop circles? It doesn't seem right, does it? But we know it's possible. Here's a photograph of an ordinary wind vortex, a type of stationary whirlwind produced during the high summer, exactly the times of year and the weather conditions and in the geographical locations where these crop circles are all appearing. There is hard statistical evidence linking the location, the time and the weather conditions of crop circles with precisely those factors which you would deduce from meteorology would be responsible for the production of these sort of things. That was in a serial field, rotating and twisting, staying in one location. It didn't produce a crop circle, unfortunately, in this instance, largely because the field had been harvested at that time. But one can easily envisage that it would have happened in an ordinary serial field. These things last just for a very short period of time, a few seconds at most. They descend from the sky, twist and go again. They're usually mistakenly called whirlwinds or tornadoes by the media who don't understand physics. I don't understand physics all that well. I'm sure most of you don't. But so it's understandable why they would use terms like that. But it's actually a sort of derogatory, dismissive term, which helps us to forget that there are many types of vortex effect which could produce it. And some of them can be very short-lived, very precise, and very stationary like this. And they can also come in multiples. They don't have to be single things. There's a double-funneled tornado. You've got a tornado in the centre, basically staying still, and the twister around the outside going round in a circle. So, again, in a serial field, not from this effect, because this would be much too destructive, but on a smaller scale, if it were possible, with less energy, you would get a single circle in the middle and a ring around the outside, just as we've got in some of these cases. So it doesn't have to stop at single circles. There can be weather causes for more complex circles. There's our old friend the mowing devil, just to show you again that crop circle events have been around for a very long time. And there's proof again from a newspaper report from June 1960 of rings turning up inside a field in Gloucestershire. So again, as I say, it isn't a recent phenomenon, it is something which is long-standing. But is this of any relevance at all, if it's true, to the UFO field? Is there any way in which we can use this to explain away UFOs? I think we can. I think this has actually provided us with the final piece of the jigsaw, the key to the UFO phenomenon. What can it explain? Well, plug time now. In our book, Crop Circles, A Mystery Solved, that Paul Fuller and I have got coming out next month, some copies of which may or may not be available unless they've all gone here, we have made an attempt to link in the work that's been done by these scientists to the UFO phenomenon. And we've been absolutely astonished at the way in which it can explain even the most classic cases. Car stop cases, cases where animal interference occurs, marks on the ground, even, and I know there are going to be people who are not going to find this hard to believe, but even abduction cases. The two probably best known abduction cases in this country are the case at Aveley in Essex, where the witnesses encountered initially a sort of blue light and basically a mist or fog or cloud across the road, lost a period of time, and that was it, essentially. Everything else added on, the classic abduction, medical examination, etc., was a product of after the fact. The basic conscious experience was an encounter with something like this, which was real, physical, and did physical things to the car. It affected the radio, for instance, made it crackle and sparkle and cut out. So there was a real energy there, no doubt at all. But beyond that, we don't know what was added by the investigation techniques and the hypnosis that was used and what was real. And the other case is the Alan Godfrey one, where in this instance in Todmorden, the witness also actually found a crucial clue. He found on the wet road surface, it had been raining earlier in the night, a frontal system had passed over, exactly like meteorology would predict. On the wet road surface underneath where the spinning top-shaped object, which was rotating and causing the trees to vibrate and shake with wind at the side of the road, had hovered, he found a perfectly swirled circle on the road, dried by heat or evaporation or something, but if it had been in a field, it would have been a crop circle. It was on a road, so it wasn't. But that, to me, is almost the coup de grace, because this is one of the best-known abduction cases in the world. It's in the records of UFO researchers everywhere. In the catalogue compiled by Eddie Bullard, which has been referred to several times this weekend, it was rated as the most important British case. Yet it's an abduction, again, produced by hypnosis. And the witness himself has said of that hypnosis and the memories that he came out with, he doesn't know how real they were. He read UFO books in the period between the experience and the period between when the hypnosis happened, and he cannot say that he didn't invent the story subconsciously in his mind based on that. But he does know that what he saw on the road ahead of him, rotating around, doing these physical things, was real. Therefore, I believe that we at least have to take seriously the idea that we are dealing with some physical force, some phenomenon which is real, frightening, can do dangerous things to people at times, and which has to be taken seriously. And think less about what happens after that and start worrying about aliens invading us and doing nasty things to us, because that's only going to put off most scientists. We need the help of the scientists, otherwise we're not going to get anywhere, and we'll be sitting here in another 20 years having the same arguments. To me, that would be a complete waste of time, and I don't want to see that happen. think since I've about had my hour, I better stop at that point and leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Quite having you, Howard. We still have some time for some questions.
How can the weather theory explain a crop circle in which there is no star pattern but a cross
pattern? You're talking about...
That happened last year.
Yes, you mean the one that had a sort of dartboard type, four different quarters?
No, a cross where there were 4 quarters. And
yes, I know the one you mean.
One this way, this way, this way, this way.
Yes, I know the one you mean. Well, it was a similar effect. I mean, the sort of 4-quarter pattern that you're talking about was difficult to detect except from the air.
The picture was perfectly clear.
Yes.
It's like a drawing which the cross hatched.
Yes, from a certain angle. You've seen it what?
Right, I've seen a picture exactly.
Yeah. Yes, but there was still the same sort of effect on the ground. I don't know whether Paul's here, because Paul was actually at that location.
No, the crops were actually put into this...
I don't know whether Paul's in the room. Are you, Paul? Did you actually go there? No? Sorry, she's talking about the circle formation last year, which was basically a circle with a quartered pattern. She's only seen the aerial photographs, but it was the same basic effect within it, wasn't it? It was just slight differences. It was
the same basic effect at all. The stalks were laid parallel to each other in diametrically opposing quarters.
No, it wasn't quite like that. No, it wasn't quite like that.
What was it like then?
It was basically swirls, but they were in full...
No, I'm sorry, you must be thinking of a different one.
Well, maybe I am.
I'm sorry, we can't keep going backwards and forwards. We have the gentleman down here.
Yeah, you mentioned hypnotic regression twice there.
Yes.
In the Godfrey case, then first of all, when you suggested that if somebody had been regressed, we know what could happen. If you're going to sum up your own general view on it, where do you stand on hypnotic regression?
I personally believe that hypnotic regression is more a hindrance than a help, purely because all the people I've talked to who've been involved in research, doctors, psychologists and so on, are not sure what results. They can't tell whether what results is factual, fictional or a mixture of both, and it usually is a mixture of both. There is no doubt that at times it can facilitate memory. You can use it, for instance, to get people to remember a car registration number if they were involved in a crime or something. But it also has been proven by experiment that it also can generate spurious memories that never happened. Now, because of that, it's very dangerous in a terribly emotive situation, like someone who's seen a UFO and is under a lot of pressure, subtly and subconsciously, to come up with the goods. If you're taking them along to a doctor and they're themselves wanting to remember what happened in the missing time period that clearly occurred, to take too much stress on what actually results via hypnosis. There